Check 1, 2. Can you guys hear me? Are you guys awake? Out there crying alone in the darkness? Woo! Thanks for coming to the 2 o'clock show. I'm going to talk about problem algae management in reef tanks, and I'm going to start right now. If you want to leave because I'm talking, that's great. And if you want to move up, that's even better. But a little bit about me. My name is Rich Ross. I like cephalopods a lot. This is my family. We take Halloween very seriously, or that's a bad Tuesday. I'm a kiteboarder, and I like to kiteboard over corals whenever I can. This was in Tonga, and it was amazing. Usually you're trying to go fast when you're kiting, but I was going as slow as possible, like trying to ID each coral as I went over it. I'm so glad I closed that water. I live on a little island, and sometimes I like to do this to my neighbors and follow them around on my board and make them think death is chasing them. This is my secret home lab, which is an extension of my display tank, which I'll show you in a second. And what's going on there, I'm looking at the bottom left tank there. I'm getting ready to hopefully spawn some corals in November or December. So that's a whole nother thing. If you're interested in that, talk to me afterwards. I'm happy to talk to you about it. This is my display tank. Oh, the colors look so great on the screen. I love it. It's a 150-gallon tank. The entire system volume in the house distributed is about 500 gallons now. And this tank's been set up for about 20 years. And I also have this podcast with this guy sitting up front, because he has to, because I do a podcast with him, called Reef Beef, which won this year and last year, 2 years running, the most vulgar reef-related podcast from Vulgar Reef Podcasts International. Woo! So, problem algae in reef tanks. What's the deal with algae, right? The thing we don't like about the algae is it can do this to our tanks. It can run amok, it can cover all your corals, and it can kill stuff. And that's suboptimal. If you want to be keeping coral, you don't want something to smother and kill it. So there's some common advice that we are given when we have algae problems or algae issues. And people usually do all of these at the same time and then credit whatever the last thing they did was as having the effect. So you get told to use chemicals just to wait it out, lower your nutrients, manual removal, herbivores, thoughts and prayers, which totally works. Additives to control algae. So there was this one that some people had some success with for a few years, and it turns out that it's probably just an algicide, which explains why some people had coral deaths when they tried to use it. Here's another popular one. This one seems to work, especially for bryopsis, and it seems relatively safe. My feeling with these kinds of additives, they make me nervous because we're working so hard to make our reef tanks as stable as possible. That's like one of the baseline pieces of advice you get for a reef tank. You want to keep it stable. So you work really hard to make your tank as stable as possible, and then you dump some stuff in that kills a bunch of stuff. It just makes me feel like there's a better way to go about it, because you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. Like I say, though, this one seems to be vetted pretty well. A bunch of people have used it, and they say good things about it. Still makes me nervous, because I think there's a philosophical approach that's different. If you've gotten we'll get to this. I'm getting ahead of myself. A lot of times people are talking about the uglies when you set up a new tank and you seem to get algae problems. And my new thing to talk about is this idea called Benthic succession. And briefly, that's new substrates get colonized by different microfauna and bacteria. And as those things grow, they outcompete real estate for algae. So when you have a brand new substrate, algae can grow on that really easily. As time goes on, you can't so much. This is just a picture. This is a place called Buck Island. This is in the Caribbean near St. Croix. And this is actually an algae graveyard. You can see here is a little tiny bit of Acropalmata that's still alive. Everywhere else used to be Palmata. It's all dead now. So it's a really sad place to go swimming through. But look at the color of all this. This is, coral skeleton. That's live rock. Look at the color of that. It is not this color. So I think in the last 5 or 7 years, the idea that your rock is this color has taken hold, and people think it should always be that color. That's not at all what happens. As benthic succession happens, different animals and microfauna grow on it. So you get it, so it starts looking green. Here's a good slide I took yesterday. This is 2 pieces of Stax rock. It's a Marco rock that's been cut into slices that's really nice for aquascaping or for planting corals on. This one here is brand new. I just put it in. This one here is the same box of rock, but it's been about 3 months. So your rock does not stay that color. It changes. So be ready for that. And then as stuff goes, algae can take really good hold of it. If you stay ahead of the algae and don't let it get too crazy, eventually other stuff grows on the rocks, corals, and even coralline algae that outcompetes the real estate battle that's happening in your tank. Controlling nutrients to end algae problems. This is one of the main things people are given advice about. If you have high nitrate and phosphate, the first thing people say if you have an algae problem is you want to lower it, right? But the problem with this algae is, the problem with this idea is that the nitrate on wild reefs is less than 0.2 parts per million. In our tanks, we recommend somewhere between, depending on who you're talking to, 2 parts per million and 10 parts per million or 15 parts per million. Wild reefs, 0.2. Phosphate, 0.03. So algae are really good at life. They've developed over millions of years to be able to grow on almost nothing. So kind of the idea of lowering your nitrates and your phosphates and hoping to starve them out is not the best way to go. The argument tends to go like this. Algae needs fertilizer, so more fertilizer means more algae, and less fertilizer means less algae. QED, right? Except there are always people reporting that lowered nutrients didn't impact their algae. There are people with high nutrients who have no algae problems, people with low nutrients that have algae problems. So this idea, just anecdotally, doesn't really seem to have much traction. The other version of it is, it's the same exact slide, so we'll skip that. The point is not so much, right? Like I'm saying, algae is really good at life. So I'm going to show you a video that helps kind of get the feel of what I'm talking about in it. In this video, the cat is your coral, the food is your nutrients, and the duck is your algae. Okay, here we go. Yeah, there we go. So no matter, your algae needs so little to survive on. If you're dropping your phosphates from 0.2 to 0.1, your algae still has plenty to grow on. Now, it may have less to grow on, but it's still going to do just fine. On wild reefs, there's a ton of algae, except where is it in this picture? You don't see it, right? It's there. I promise you it's there. Oh, that's bad. That's exactly not what you're supposed to see. Thank God I closed my browser. Well, maybe not. It's that kind of show. Let me see. Okay, that did it again. Hold on. There's some weird thing coming up. I'm just going to start ignoring it if it's still there. Here's another piece of wild reef that's perfectly healthy, totally filled with algae, but you don't see it. Why don't you see it, right? Because there's a battle for real estate. And here's what's going on. How does coral win this battle for real estate? It doesn't. There's a third party that gets involved. Herbivores, right? These huge schools, this was in French Polynesia. I happened to go there in February, and I was snorkeling around and realized, made a lot of connections and figured out a good way to try to talk about it, which is what I'm doing here. These guys are swimming around the reef all the time, eating. If there wasn't a lot of algae, there wouldn't be huge schools of herbivores on the reef. because there's no food for them. They need the algae. They are eating it as quickly as it can grow. This was a little area called the Coral Garden, and you could swim around this island in about 25 minutes. And there was about 5 schools of convict tanks this big. And you can also see a bunch of parrotfish, and there's schools of parrotfish. And they're just swimming around everywhere, chowing down on the algae before it can take hold, so that the coral can fight for it, for real estate, and take over and do fine. There's also sharks swimming around there, which is important in a second. Also on reefs, where you do see the algae, is places like this. Inside of this stand of coral, there's a damselfish. See him right there? He's a jackass. They fight off all the herbivores. And see inside the coral, you see all the algae growing in there? They're farming the algae because they like to lay their eggs in it or spawn demons or whatever these terrible fish do. And they're just horrible. And in this area, that's not planned, but that's really funny. They take over the inside of these coral stands, and it's just filled with algae. In this particular, on the reef I showed you just previously, there was a few of these. On this reef, they were everywhere. And the difference was, on the previous reef, there were 3 sharks, 3 blacktips, that continuously patrolled the reef. And damsels are really yummy to those sharks. On this area of reef, which was in another location, no sharks anywhere. And there was algae everywhere. It was horrible. It was even spreading inside of these coral stands. So there's kind of a famous experiment that you'll read in almost any oceanography textbook. If you protect an area of reef from herbivores, so herbivores can't get there, algae will grow in that area. It's such a basic experiment that I'm not even looking it up and giving you a reference to it. It's in all the books. It's like basic thing taught. Remember this, Buck Island from St. Croix? Why is there no algae there? Because these poor tang still live there in this ghost town of a reef, and they're eating the algae before it could become problematic. It's still happening. Here's a nice picture. You can see the top half. Up here, there's no algae. Down here, there's algae. And the reason for that is this is a diadema urchin study. And diademas only have a certain range, and then they go home at night. They don't just travel like nomads and gypsies across the sea floor. They have an area. You can see there pretty clearly the edge of their domain. Where there's algae, no diadema. Where there is no algae, diadema. And this was a problem. In the 80s, there was a diadema die-off in the Caribbean, and we got a lot of algae growth, right? We had reefs turn from coral-dominated to algae-dominated. And it wasn't just the diadema, it wasn't just pollution, it wasn't just runoff, it was overfishing of the fish herbivores as well. So all of these kind of go hand in hand, but I think the most important one is herbivores. And we don't just need to look, excuse me, to the wild to see this. This is my tank. No algae. If you care, right now the phosphate is 0.2 and the nitrates are like 18. 2 years ago, the nitrates were 50 and the phosphate was like 0.9. I just brought it down to see if I could slowly without killing anything, which kind of worked, but I don't really care so much. No algae in this tank. It's because of the herbivores. Here is my Euro brace, where the herbivores can't get to, but there's enough water for the algae to grow. And algae grows like crazy. At times when I'm not paying attention and my overflows have clogged a little and the water levels come up 1/4 inch in the tank, that gets filled with water all the time. And every week I can harvest a 500 ml cup of algae just from my Euro bracing. So here it is. Herbivores can't get to it. It grows. Where there's herbivores, it grows, but it gets eaten, just like on a wild reef. Here's a frag tank I set up under the house. And for one reason or another, I actually can't remember what happened. I was gone, and the herbivores died. Something happened. The snails all died. And I came home, and it was covered in algae. I grabbed some herbivores from the store, some snails and some urchins. I put them in there, and a week later, that's what it looked like. And now that's what it looks like there. There's just no algae there. When I was putting this talk together a month ago, I was scouring that tank for any algae at all, and I did find a temp probe with some algae, And then I went to the MACNA conference and I showed this slide and I said, and I moved this temp probe to where it was floating in the air, in the air. It was floating in the water column so none of the snails or urchins could get to it. So I took this the day before I left for the conference, pushed it down by the egg crate, and I made the bold claim that by the time I got home, the algae would be gone from it now that the herbivores could get to it. And this was the day I got home from MACNA, and they had eaten all the algae on it. So it feels pretty compelling. I think, clearly, because this is my case, I think it's very compelling. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it works out. Herbivores are important. And now, you can't just use herbivores, though. There's a couple of ideas for managing algae that are good to keep in mind. The first one is get it while it's small. I find a lot of people, and this is what I think is a real danger of giving people the advice to control nutrients, to control algae, is that it will take 2 months to bring down their nutrient levels and not do anything about the algae in the meantime. By that time, the algae has taken hold. And it's very hard to phase change an ecosystem from algae dominant back to coral dominant. It's actually really hard to, it's easier, but it is hard to change it from coral dominant to algal dominant. So the idea is if you see algae, get them while they're small. You can see here, there's a little bit of algae here, a little bit of bubble algae. I found this on a forum about a month or two ago, and this person, oddly enough, was talking about they'd seen that little bit of algae next to the frag plug, and they were asking if they should take their tank down and start again because now they had algae. And I kind of blew my mind that that's the thought, that there should be no algae growing anywhere. There should be algae. It's a part of the system that you're putting together. You just want to manage it so it doesn't kill the stuff you like, right? While we're talking about bubble algae, this is Valonia. It's bubble algae. It's called sailor's eyeballs because apparently sailors have tiny, tiny green eyes. For a long time, people say don't pop it. You got to be very careful and siphon it out and scrape it off because there's spores inside. That's not true. There's no reproductive cells inside of the bubbles. The reproductive cells are on the outside of them. And I could show you some papers that talks about this, but it's in phycologist. Somebody who studies algae is a phycologist. It's in phycologist speak, and it's like impossible to understand what they're actually saying unless you understand their language, which I kind of do. But you can find paper after paper that describes this single-celled animal, really, and there is nothing reproductive going on inside. So pop the crap out of it. Just pop it and scrape it off. We'll get to that too. Like I said, I do like herbivores. I have 2 cautions about herbivores. The 2 herbivores types I'm going to caution you against. This is a sea hare. It can be very good at actually mowing down algae, but then it starves to death. And I think that's a horrible thing. That's like getting a puppy so you can pet it on Friday and then ignoring it till it dies because you don't feel like petting it anymore. Some people will pass these around from tank to tank. You know, in a club, they'll share it. They usually end up outlasting the algae anyway. You might be able to give these guys algae tabs to eat as well, but they just kind of don't last. So for me, it feels like you're trying to make a fix that doesn't kind of really work and then dies, and that feels kind of icky to me. Even worse are something like this, the Elysia crispa. They are obligate. They need to get their cells from eating algae. They don't live nearly as heartily as a sea hare, but you see them brought in from time to time. They just rub me the wrong way. It just seems like the wrong kind of way to go. We don't need to be harvesting animals from the wild to use them for a couple weeks and watch them die. Off my ethical high horse. Like I was mentioning a little bit ago, herbivores are great, but they're not really like a cure-all, right? Some of them work, some of them don't work. Some of them down to individuals, right? Somebody says tuxedo urchins are the best. They mow down your algae. It's like some of them do, some of them don't. I actually find the tuxedos pretty good. We find this in snails a lot. People say, these snails are great. And then somebody says, I got them and nothing happened. It's like, well, yeah, because it's a biological control. So either you have to get the biological control because you're really interested and you like that animal, or it's not going to bother you so much if it doesn't do its job, right? So don't get a giant unicorn tang to take care of your algae, because that's going to grow into a 2-foot-long fish. Right? That's not the right animal for you to get. You want to set up the herbivores for success as well. They're like deer. Long algae, they're usually not so interested in, at least the ones we keep. Bumphead parrotfish, which get 3 feet long in the wild, they'll mow down big chunks of algae. They'll actually take the rock off too when they eat it. But that's not what we keep in our tanks. We don't have space for that. So it's like a deer. A deer will come into your yard. I'm in California. We don't have yards. We don't have deer. We have a yard, no deer. But a deer, you guys have deer here, right, in Illinois? You're maggoty with deer. They're everywhere. They will eat the leaves off of your prize trees, whatever they are, but they won't eat the branches, right? It's kind of, and I'm guessing, I don't know anything about deer except for what I learned in college about white-tailed deer. But the herbivores tend not to eat the branches. They like the succulent leaves. I think that's analogous with the algae we want to get rid of. Old algae that's established is not as tasty as mown down new shoots of algae. So what you can do is you can crop down long algae, right? Manual removal is your best friend. Reach in with your hands, just pull the algae out. If you have a problem rock, you can just pull that rock out. You don't have to, if you've got a newer tank, and by the way, your approach to algae management is different in a new tank than it is in an older tank. I think I have a cue to get back to that, but if I don't, please go, hey, say that if you want to hear about it. If you've got rock, just pull it out. You can scrub it outside the tank. You don't need to bleach it. You could put some kind of acid on it. You could put, what's that? You mentioned it. Put it on your teeth. Peroxide, hydrogen peroxide. You could kill it with that too. Rinse it off in some tank of water, put it back. You can also just flip the rock upside down, and now the algae is getting no more light, and it will just die, and that works too. Kill it while it's small. When you see a little bit of algae, do something about it. So what can that be? You can clip the infected coral or rock with bone shears and literally scrape the algae off or break off a little piece. Or my favorite is that you can smother it with 2-part epoxy. You can take any of the 2-part epoxies that we use. You can even use super glue and make a little pancake of it. You can make a big pancake, and you put it over the algae-covered area, and you leave it there. And if you don't like that, in a couple months you can pull it off, and all the algae will be smothered. The 2-part epoxies come off pretty easy, the ones in the trade at least, and the super glue will come off as well. I don't like super glue as much because you can't really make it into a nice pancake and make sure you've covered the entire area, but epoxy you can. I used to work at the Steinert Aquarium, and we had a 200,000-gallon reef tank, and we had an area that had bryopsis on it, and it started as a patch about the size of my hand by the time we saw it, and it kept growing and growing and growing, and people insisted that we tried all kinds of normal ways of trying to get rid of it, which was essentially deal with nutrients, which never worked. I eventually went in and took a can of Z-Spar. It's a big marine epoxy that public aquariums love to use, I think because it's really expensive and it's really, really hard. So I took about $300 worth of this epoxy and mixed it up and made a big pancake and covered this 1/2 meter size area of bryopsis, pushed it down, sealed it up, and we never heard from bryopsis in that tank again. It's just gone. You've sequestered it from everything, it dies and it's gone. But on a smaller scale, it works really well as well. The other thing that you want to do is pop bubble algae. I already went over that, but you want to pay attention to your herbivore population. One time, about 4 or 5 years ago, I noticed I started having algae growing in my display tank, and I wasn't sure what was going on. What did I do wrong? And I realized that I had to remove a rabbitfish because it started eating corals, right? Herbivores sometimes go off the reservation, no matter how vegan they say they are. And I also had a lower population of snails and urchin than I usually ran. I just stopped paying attention and it got away from me. I got another foxface, not saying foxfaces are the best, we'll get to that in a sec. Got some more snails, got some more urchins, and within 2 weeks, algae problem gone. So it can work. Herbivores I like. I really like these urchins. These are Maspila. tuxedo urchin. You can even get them captive bred and tiny, and then they get into nooks and crannies really well. They tend to, if you scrape the algae down, they tend to stay on top of it for you. They're really great, and you can take little 3D printed plastic hats and put them in your aquarium, and then they'll walk around with them on, which I think is an awesome trend because we're trying to stop plastics in the environment, but we want to put them in our tanks so our urchins wear hats. I think that's very cool. Tangs can be very good. Yellow tang is pretty good. You can get those captive raised now. My favorite fish in all the oceans, one of my favorite fish, is the powder blue tang, but I think they're terrible fish for our tanks because they're jackasses. They're mean. They're just mean, and they eat algae, but they're mean to everybody, and they swim around real fast and knock stuff over. So I don't think they're great. Don't get one of those for algae problems. Get one of them because you like them, and you like to watch them swim in circles around in the front of your 50-gallon tank. Don't get one of those unless you have a bigger tank. But the yellow tanks seem to do very well. There's a couple kinds of rabbitfish, and again, some of them get appetites for meaty meats, which are your corals, and if you paid $500 for gorilla nipple xenia or whatever it is, they're going to eat it maybe. These are both, the gold line one is available captive bred from biota, so that's always a good way to go. And the other kind of common Velpunus ones, those are great as well. But again, they're not always going to do what you want them to do. They're a cleanup crew, but they're not paid enough to necessarily do the job you want them to do. So if you're going to get a fish, make sure you like the fish. These are Astrea snails. They're one of the common ones that are really good for algae that people recommend a lot. So I like them as well. They're also very good to feed to mantis shrimp. But again, you want to mow it down. One of the snails, and there's a bunch more, but one of the snails people really like to recommend for long hair algae is a Mexican turbo. And you'll find people online who say, yes, these guys decimate my algae. I can move it from one tank to another and it will mow it down. And somebody else will go out and get some Mexican turbos and it won't touch their algae at all. And people go crazy trying to figure out what's going on. This is individual preference in an individual tank, right? There was even a thing for a while, people would say, oh, you got the Mexican turbos that don't like the algae. You know, they're from South Mexico. What are you talking about? It's just individual preference. What's the other snail that I like, Ben? Red-banded trochus. I like trochus snails as well. And there's a big zebra snail, zebra trochus, I think, but they get huge, so you might not want to use them. And then also don't forget about your microfauna that like to eat algae as well. So it's nice to have a nice pod population, an amphipod population. This is a Gammarus. They'll eat rotting stuff, but they'll also get into the algae and eat the stuff at the base of it, which might or might not help the algae from growing. So what do you do when this happens? The horror, right? You've listened to AlgaeGone 587 on algaegone.com forum. You've never seen a picture of their tank, and you've just taken their advice because you're at your wit's end, and you try to do what they say, and this happens. By the way, if you're going to take somebody's advice about keeping a reef tank, find a picture of their tank. If they don't have a tank that you like, don't copy their advice. There's 80 million ways to do a reef tank, right? You might as well listen to the person who's got a tank like the one you want to have in your house. I don't know if you like mine or not, but I always show a picture of it, so at least you know looks like I can keep stuff alive. It could all be Photoshop, who knows? It doesn't. So you've done that, and your tank looks like this. What do? You can nuke it from space. You can tear it down and start again, but you've gone through all this benthic progression that's already happened. Your rocks are seasoned and delicious. And it doesn't have to be a crushing problem. You can change out the rock with non-infected rock, right? If you can flip the rock over, we said that earlier as well. You can take it out and scrub it or use 10% muriatic acid. I didn't tell you to use muriatic acid because it can hurt you, but it's really cool. It really works. It's not the same muriatic acid that you buy for your pool. That's like 37%. This is a 1 to 10 dilution. 10 parts water, 1 part of that acid. If you mix that up yourself, be very careful with gloves and a face shield. A face shield. Sign language, face shield. Remove the algae by hand or with tools and filter the water. The old idea used to be is if you were going to scrub the rock in your tank, you wanted to siphon at the same time so none of the algae spread throughout your tank, which makes no sense because your tank looks like this. It's already there. Who cares? Scrub the crud out of it. I actually stopped myself from saying crap. Scrub it as much as you want. I like this thing a lot. This is the Marine Land polishing filter. It comes with a pleated cartridge. I wish I had stock in this product and this company. It's got a pleated filter on it. You scrub the algae, let this thing run. It'll suck up most of the algae, and then you rinse the pleated filter after a day or two, and you're good. I had a tank once that went completely hair algae while I was gone in the lab when the lab was new. And I got home, and I just pulled out handfuls and handfuls of algae, put one of these in there, scrubbed everything, didn't do anything else. It wrapped around corals, the algae, but by the next day, it had all gotten loose and was gone. Didn't have a problem after that. Algae problems are managed, not fixed, right? The trick is to manage the algae problem. You're going to get algae. It's how it grows. I was talking to my friend from Monterey Bay Aquarium about this, and we were talking about, can you actually get phosphate and nitrates to 0 in our tanks? I don't think you can. I don't think it's possible just from what's floating around in the air. Algae is going to grow. It can be your friend. But if you plan for it, you can manage it and deal with it. You don't want to set up a tank with a bunch of brand new rock and then blast it with light and hope that you don't get algae. You're going to get algae. Back in the 2000s, back in the caveman days of reef keeping, we used to say, get your rock, put it in your tank. It was live rock by the time. There's still benthic succession that happens, but it's not as radical. And keep your tank in the dark for 1 or 2 months and then slowly bring out the lights and add things to it. That advice, I think, still makes sense. What a lot of people don't want to do is put a bunch of new rock in their tank, in their living room, and then have nothing going on in there for a couple months. I understand that. If that's you, you've got a couple choices. You can get your rock from a fish store that has got it already seasoning in some kind of tank somewhere for a couple of months. Then it's already, the succession has happened. You're in good shape. You could put a bunch of rock in a friend's sump and wait for that as well. I think Unique Corals is going to have seasoned rock for sale in the next few months. Or you can take a big trash can, buy your rock, shove your rock in that trash can, fill it with salt water, put some circulation in the heater on it, and leave it in there for a couple of months. You might need to do a couple water changes here and there. You might want to spike it with a piece of live rock from somewhere else. But let all that happen while you're setting up the tank inside the house. By the time the tank is ready to have water in it, you've got deliciously seasoned rock. Use the progression, the benthic succession, to your advantage instead of hoping that it's not going to make a difference. It is going to make a difference. You're going to get nailed. You can't avoid it. And that's like a new tank. As the tank gets older, it becomes easier to manage because your coral is taking up the real estate that your algae wants to have. And if you're getting herbivores and paying attention to the algae and pulling out when it's small, your corals will win the real estate war. Small effort pays off big. I think also a lot of people want reef tanks to be like a set and forget piece of living art that they set up and then never have to do anything to. That's not how it works. It needs management. It doesn't need a lot of work, but it does need constant management. Like Joe Waiulo says, a reef tank is a never-ending chess match opponent, and you just have to kind of outthink it. Turns out, if you have a good plan in your head for what's going on in your tank and you want to have happen in your tank, your reef tank might not be a very good chess player. It's got a few moves that you can get ahead of pretty easily. I want to thank Aquashella, I want to thank Beefers and everybody I know, and especially Fair Use Laws, because I didn't credit any photos. This is the podcast we have, Reef Beef. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be here right now. I ended a little early, so if you have questions, I can entertain them now, or you can find me on the show floor. Thank you for your attention. Sir, yes, sir, you have a question?
In your earlier slide, it said QED, and it
In my earlier slide, I said QED, and I didn't explain. Quite easily demonstrated, which almost means no. It's not quite. It's too simple. Anything else? Yes, sir. Red sticky algae in freshwater that you need a razor blade to get off. I don't know what you're specifically talking about, but it feels like the same kind of thing to me. It could be a cyanobacteria. I'd have to see it to have a better idea about it, or any of the freshwater people. I haven't done freshwater in a minute, but I think it's the same kind of thing. Either you can find something that might eat it, but only get it if you like that animal. Otherwise, it's just something that you have to scrape off from time to deal with. As long as it's not that red beard algae, that stuff's horrible. I hate that. Yes, sir, Mr. Newbie. Never mind, okay. Anyone else? All right, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.